All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get rolling. Thank you for coming tonight. I know it is a nice night. I appreciate you giving up some time to help us out. My name is Richard Montgomery, Superintendent for the district. We got a lot of help tonight, and we're going to jump right in, but I'm going to get things started just with a quick overview. Okay, so we are tackling the master planning process for the district. Basically, we've talked a lot about district needs over the last couple of years, and we've gone through the PEPL process. We've gone through the process of collecting feedback after the bond and PEPL attempts. And our biggest takeaway was that our community wants us to involve as many stakeholders as possible in getting input, but really that we want to look as far as we can into the future, knowing that things change as you go and you have to adapt, but that we wanted a long-term vision and a long-term plan. And so we turned to Envision and Boyd Jones. We've got a team here to help us tonight. We've got Laura, Ryan, and Andrew. And through the last few months, they've kind of walked us through the master planning process. We've got ideas tonight, and they're going to share some of those with us. Nothing is finalized. It's really in the development stage, and tonight's about getting feedback and having questions asked that guide the process. But there's been a lot of input already to this point. I think we've involved about 100 stakeholders, various groups, students, staff, community members, civics groups, board members, through a lot of meetings, a lot of them that I wasn't a part of and staff weren't a part of. And this team helped to collect feedback in terms of what's working, what are needs of the district, and they've helped to shape that into ideas. And so we'll kind of go through a presentation. There'll be 20 minutes or so. Maybe more? 30?
Going for hopefully less than 30.
Okay.
I'm a fast talker, so we'll see.
Laura will do good. It's exciting. We've run through this information a little bit already, so I got a sneak peek in terms of where this input's taken us. But it'll be about 30 minutes of information sharing to get you up to speed with feedback that the committee's given and ideas that have spun off of that. Okay, and so we'll get through that part, and again, Laura will repeat some of this, but then there'll be opportunity for questions, whether you want to ask those openly or through note cards. There'll be some stations in here. There'll be a Lincoln Center tour because that's a big topic of conversation for anybody interested in that. But that opportunity will exist. I think one thing I want to say, and it will come out as we go through the process as well, is that this is ongoing. We really probably will be back here in the fall repeating some of these conversations and working through it next year. So this is just the beginning. And also, everything to start with is being recorded tonight, including the presentation, so we plan to share this out, get as many eyes on it as possible for more feedback. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Envision and Boyd Jones and let you guys take us away.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
I'm Laura Peterson. I'm an architect and an educational planner with Envision Architecture. And Envision's a company, an Iowa-based company. We've been around for over 100 years, and we do K-12 work across the state. We've done over $1 billion in K-12 construction over the last 10 years. And I think people assume, at least a lot of my family members assume, I just go across the state and stamp out school plans. You know, like school in this community must look just like school in this community looks just like school in this community. And what we found is it couldn't be farther from the truth. Our public education system is very rooted in the communities that we're in. So I get the chance to go across the state and meet with stakeholder groups, parents, students, teachers, understand what the vision for education is, understand maybe what the challenges are in your current facilities, and then how can facilities help to support your goals for education in your community. So I'll let the rest of our team introduce themselves.
My name is Ryan Ellsworth, also at Envision as an architect, work with Laura. I've got 20 years in the K-12 market.
Andrew Blesny, I'm a project manager for Boyd Jones. I do more of the construction side of the stuff, building buildings. I've been doing K-12 work for about 10 years now.
So tonight, we're going to give an update on the master plan process so far. As Richard said, nothing has been finalized. The goal is that the final recommendation from the task force will go to the board in the fall after we present this again with some updates. So this is really kind of where we're at in the process today. I'm going to go through the presentation. Then once the presentation is done, there'll be a few options. We'll have kind of design and construction over here where you can come ask questions. We'll have district staff over here where you can come and ask questions. And then also, as Richard said, there'll be a tour of Lincoln Center and for those that want to go on it. We talked a lot about master planning. What is master planning? I think that master planning, as we look at it, it's really a framework for decision making. Your staff make decisions every day about facilities, what to fix, where to spend money, what's the hottest item that needs fixed, what are we going to do this summer, what are the projects, how do we move classrooms around. And as we've talked a lot about, the community and the district need to do that with a long-term vision of where things are headed. So you know where to focus dollars and how to set your budget for every single year with a long-term vision of where things are going. And so we've been going through a process of setting that master plan. That process, as we look at it, is based off of 3 questions. We started by looking at where are we, what's our current state of the district, and then where do we want to be, what's our vision for our community and for our school district moving forward, and then lastly, how do we get there? What are the plans or the options that we could take to get to where we're hoping to be? We started this process back in February. We started with kind of what we call an insight or discovery day. As Richard said, it was kind of full of stakeholder engagement. We met with almost 100 people that day, anything from students, civic leaders, staff, community members, teachers, to really understand kind of current state, what the challenges are, and also what are the bigger things happening out in the community? What are the things that we should know about? And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. And then we started to meet with a community task force. We'll talk about that kind of on the next slide. Then we came back in March, started to really define needs, met again with a group of teachers and a community task force, and then met one more time in April to really test some of the approaches that you'll see tonight and get feedback on those. We're going to meet tonight. We're going to kind of take a break in the summer because that's kind of what schools do. It's hard to get anyone's attention in the summer. And then come back in the fall, bring this information back to the community, look for more input, and then finalize the master plan in the fall. I think one of the things that the school board really wanted to do was to take this decision and get community feedback and stakeholder engagement on it. So we've been using a community task force process. So you can see we have almost, I think, just over 20 community members on our task force. Anything from parents, civic leaders, people that have been lifers, people that maybe aren't lifers in the community, teachers, to really get kind of a broad set of feedback on the options moving forward. It's been really good conversation, not easy conversation. This probably doesn't surprise you. You can't afford everything that you want to do in a district, which is not uncommon across the state of Iowa. So a lot of conversations about what are the priorities moving forward. So where are we as a district? I think the first thing we like to understand is just generally what are the properties and buildings that you have. So hopefully most of you know this. You have kind of a few main attendance centers. Kendall serves as the district office and pre-K building. Grant serves as your K through 2 building. Lincoln Center is 3 through 6. You have your 7-12 building. Also, Indian Hills building and the Mix Center on this campus, which you're using for quite a few classrooms. You have the MAC. You have field space here. Bus barn building. And then also you're using, we all know the Monroe County Sports Complex and additional practice field space, but those are not properties that the district owns, but properties that the district is using at this time. And as outsiders coming in, I think one of the first things we notice is you have a lot of properties that you're trying to maintain and a lot of buildings you're trying to maintain for a community your size. I have other districts with the same population that are operating 1 K-12 building or 2 buildings. And so just a lot of properties you're trying to maintain and kind of keep up with, but generally this is where they're located at in the community. One of the next things we look at is how much space do you have as a district. Generally, do you have enough space or too much space, which is also a problem, or too little space for the amount of students you're trying to serve? And so generally what we look at first is kind of regional averages. So the gray bar you see is kind of regional average square foot per student. So what we usually see at elementary level is between 150 to 160 square feet per student. You can see at Kendall you're around 166. That's kind of hard because that's a really small building with a district office, but generally tells us you have the right amount of space. Grant, you have around 173, so generally enough space for the kids that you have there, kind of just over the average. But you can see Lincoln Center, which is a 3 through 6, which we would start to look at, might feel a little bit more like a middle school as we head to those kind of upper ranges. So usually we'd see that around 170 square feet per student. It's fallen in that kind of 144. And as we talk to teachers, we were hearing about things like small classrooms, shared gym and cafeteria, running out of spaces for kind of tucking programs and teachers into, which I think told the story of kind of maybe why we're seeing tight space at Lincoln. And then lastly, looked at the 7-12 building. Currently you have about 240 square feet per student. High schools, usually we see 200 to 225, so it tells us generally you probably have about enough space right now. But I think another thing that we looked at was you have 3 pretty big classes in here right now. And we know as we look at enrollment trends, which we'll do in a little bit, as those classes move out, your classes are starting to stabilize just a little bit at a smaller class size. And so I think the prediction is as we move forward, you might feel a few more empty classrooms or a little more space generally at the 712 building. So current enrollment, like we just talked about, what you can see here is 12th grade and then your kind of 9 through kindergarten. So generally you have your 3 biggest classes right now are 10, 11, and 12. And then after that, really kind of 9th grade through kindergarten, we see generally about an average class size of 78 students. So you've been fairly stable kind of after those 3 class sizes move out of the building. And then as we look at overall district enrollment, this goes back to 2000. I think no surprise you've seen a somewhat decline since 2000, but have been relatively flat over the last decade. I work with a lot of districts in Iowa that are doing this and declining, and a lot of districts that are rising quickly. And so as we look at school district enrollment, this is pretty predictable and pretty flat, which is in a pretty good spot to be in as you look for trying to plan for facilities. But we do know over the next 3 to 5 years, projections show that you'll lose about 20 students per year. Most of that is those larger class sizes moving out of the district in that 10 through 12 range. Next thing we look at is what have you done? When we walked through facilities, I think we were actually relatively surprised that a lot of them you have been doing some work in your facilities, and they have been generally pretty well kept. So you've been using the funds you have available to do projects. So here you can see, going back to 2011, kind of the list of projects that the district has taken on. What you'll see noted here is generally most of these projects have been paid for with SAVE and PEPAL funds that have been on hand, so cash on hand. We'll talk a little bit more about funding down the road. But the district has borrowed for a few projects, those are noted in red, and then has also used ESSER funds or COVID funds to specifically do the Lincoln security and ADA improvements. So I think a big question we talked about in the task force is, why are we borrowing money as a district to do projects? You know, we all run our own houses, and I think we all plan in a budget and try to do that work without borrowing funds. But what we tend to see in school districts is it's actually advantageous most of the time to borrow ahead and to try to do projects up front, because as we look at the cost of construction is typically rising significantly faster than interest rates or the valuation of our district. And so this is not an uncommon thing for districts to do kind of across the state. And so just as an example, right now you have about $8.2 million left on your last sales tax bond that you issued. That was in 2020. That money was borrowed at a 1.3% interest rate, which I think we all acknowledge is kind of at the bottom. But since that same time, construction costs have gone up 42%. And so if you would have waited and tried to pay as you go for those projects, I guarantee you that the cost of those projects would be significantly more today than when you borrowed those funds at the time. Next, we met with teachers. We spent a lot of time talking about what are the needs at all of our buildings and how do we understand them. So generally, we started with Kendall, heard great things about how that building is serving pre-K. Generally, as we look forward, what are potential needs? Mostly around kind of large-scale motor space, which we know is important at preschool, and generally playground improvements at that building as you look forward. Grant, just some weather tightness, specifically at doors. I think I heard some great comments from teachers about challenges that we have at doors there. Similar kind of playground improvements moving forward, some additional fencing, AC and gym. So some items that need to be addressed over the future, but generally that building was functioning pretty well. And then Lincoln Center, we heard about a lot of needs, and I think if you want to stay and go on a tour, Joellen will be happy to give you that. Generally, we heard about the need for roof replacement or major repairs on that roof, HVAC systems that are not keeping up for that building, electrical updates that are needed, exterior and structural repairs. I know you've been doing some of that, but just generally issues with kind of the wall and how it comes together with the floor, gaps in the floor, specifically there. New furniture. You know, it's little things that can really change how a classroom feels. Things like updates in a space like this that can really impact how we do teaching and learning with reconfiguring space. Playground improvements, added storage. I'll say I've never met with a group of teachers that hasn't asked for more storage, but generally that building is really lacking in storage. And then a separate gym and cafeteria. We know in school a lot it's a challenge to have gym class, and then in 5 minutes we got to switch it over, serve lunch for 2 or 3 hours, and then switch it back to gym while we're mopping up the macaroni and the ketchup that's on the floor, and we're trying to turn it into gym class. And that really drives the schedule for the entire day in elementary school, is how we're going to get lunch in here. And then at 7-12, generally this building is functioning really well, but one of the major concerns was security. No true kind of forced secure entry here like you might see at Lincoln. And also a lot of conversation about kids traveling to the MIC Center and having to go outside and come back in the building, and how does that kind of breach or not help our secure sequence. Heard from kids about, we'd really like our school to feel a little less institutional, a little less vanilla, a little more exciting. They loved a space like this, which was upgraded mostly with carpet and paint and some new furniture, but really looking for some kind of vibrant spaces. Additional parking and updated parking. Again, I would tell you, I've never met with a high school that has as much parking as they wish they would have, but definitely a need here. Student commons. This is something that we see in a lot of schools now, kind of that real gathering space. Your kids are going to a lot of other facilities and seeing a lot of other things and wondering why they don't have them here. That doesn't mean that that's what works here, and that doesn't mean that's your biggest need, but it was something we heard from students. Updated science rooms. And then lastly, self-sufficient facility. We heard about your dependency on the sports complex and on practice fields, and also some updates to those facilities to give you ADA compliance. So then where do we want to be? This started with kind of our stakeholder engagement and listening. As we said, we met with 8 focus groups, almost 100 people that day. And generally, we heard about how much people love this community. That was the biggest theme I heard throughout the entire day. I probably heard 25 times about scholarship night, which I heard just happened. And what a long marathon it is. And how that night specifically shows how business and every member of this community supports your students and are so proud of your school system. We heard a lot about kind of the past work that had been done with PEPL and Bond, and how this was about creating a clear plan of where we're going, being transparent about what we've done, and communicating that out to the community. We heard about this is not about looking around to seeing what our neighbors are doing, but solving the solutions that we need for our community. But also heard about how the future of your community will have a dependency on the schools. You know, you're in a size of community, and I heard a lot about people love it here. You have this great balance of enough to do here. You have great recreational facilities. You know, you have great things like outdoor space in Alvia, and how you have these great things. But how do you attract families here? And schools are a big part of that. And talked about, you know, taking new teachers. How do you attract them here? And young families, and walking them through buildings like Lincoln. And maybe those aren't sending the kind of biggest message of maybe why people would want to raise their family here. So from there, I really created drivers for the master plan. What are the things we need to focus on? First, maintain. The biggest focus of this has to be maintaining facilities and making sure we have a sustainable way to do so. Next, aligning, making sure that the work that we're going to do aligns with the funds that are potentially available. Then we do need to act with vision. This can't just be about status quo. If we don't think slightly differently, in a few years we might be in danger as a community and as a school system. And then lastly, support, that this whole process and plan needs to build support along the way. Through that, then the task force identified those are great, you know, big aspirational things, but what does that actually mean? So from there, really worked on priorities. First priorities was this process, coming up with a plan of how we're going to get there and a long-range plan. The next was continuing maintenance. You have been doing work at your facilities, and we cannot stop doing that at all facilities, kind of looking forward. The next priority was to address the security concerns specifically at the 7-12 building and having a way to do that. And then to move to an annual improvement cycle, making sure you have funds available to do things like new paint and carpet, new furniture, so that your buildings continue to be maintained and you don't have to go for large capital projects in the future potentially if you're doing regular improvements of your buildings. Next was to eliminate the reliance on external facilities. As someone described it, it feels a little bit like a house of cards some days. You're depending on the community for additional practice space. You're depending on the county for practice space right now. So how do we become self-reliant and control our own facilities? And one of the biggest items, the real largest focus, was what's the long-term plan for Lincoln? How are we going to address that long-term, and how does that fit into here? And then lastly, how do we potentially consolidate? We are managing a lot of square foot and a lot of facilities right now. Is there a path forward where maybe we would be trying to manage less facilities as a district? The next thing we looked at is budget buckets, and I like to say this is the architect version of school finance. And so if you have specific questions afterwards, you can, or feel free to ask them specifically to Melissa or Richard. They will answer your question in more detail. But these are generally the funding streams that are available to school districts for construction projects. I think the first thing to note is that these are separate from the funds that we can use to pay teachers. That's how the state has it set up. All of that money goes into kind of general fund. We pay teacher salaries. That's where most of those dollars go. So these are separate funds and they can't be crossed or mixed. I should say you can use your general fund to pay for school construction projects, but you don't want to be doing that. These funds are specifically set up for these kind of projects. So generally the first thing you currently have is a board PEPAL. This is something that the school board would have added. This is property tax and it's a 33-cent levy rate. Generally, that's used for maintenance, repairs, construction, technology, and small kind of upgrades. And you can see that's about $115,000 annually that the school district gets in that pot. The next, I'm going to jump a second. The next bucket that you also currently have is what we call save dollars. So that's the 1 cent penny sales tax. We all spend dollars across the state. It goes into a statewide fund. Then it gets divided out by the amount of students you have. And so it doesn't have anything to do with how much money is spent in Albia or in Monroe County, but it's divided out. The district gets about $1.2 million annually in this pot. It's sales tax based and can be used for similar kinds of projects or similar kinds of things that we just talked about with the board PEPAL. And this is the pot of money that the district has borrowed against some of your future revenues. What you do, you can borrow up to against 2050. You have not borrowed out that far. You only have, I think, about 8 years left on paying on what you have. So that's from this pot of money. The other potential pots of money that you can use for school construction in the state is a VOTA PEPAL, something you guys have heard about. That could bring up to $450,000 annually to the district. It is property tax based, and the levy rate can be up to $1.34 for that. It requires a 50% vote and can be used generally for all of the same things that we just talked about. And then the last bucket is a general obligation bond, also property tax based. You can go up to $4.05. There's kind of a few tiers within that, but that's as far as you can potentially go. You have to vote on it, and it requires a 60% plus one vote. And the thing that's different about this is you also have to be project specific. So when you vote on this, the question says, we are giving the district permission to build X, Y, and Z, and that's all those funds can be used for. Whereas these can be used on construction, technology, vehicles, furniture, repairs as general pots of money. So how do we get there? Enough talking about that, like what are the plans? What are we looking at? So generally what we talked about a lot is that this master plan had to align with potential funding streams and had to align with potential levels of community support. We needed to have options at each of those levels for what the next 10 years would look like as a district. So we talked about, as a task force, this plan happening potentially in pieces and in different levels. So generally the first level was maintain. What if we don't add any additional funding? What does our next 10 years look like? Let's plan that and understand it. The next piece is if we moved into more of a sustain, so how would we do more incremental improvements? That would have to potentially happen with a voter PEPAL. And then the last bucket was improve. Are there some larger scale changes that we would like to make that we would need to go out for a bond referendum for, and what would our next 10 years look like if that was the case? All of this happening with what's the plan, what's the long-term vision of where we're going for. And generally the idea is that the plan is the same no matter kind of which of these paths we're on, but the time that it's going to take us to get there is significantly different depending on kind of what level of support. That looks like it's this like really nice, clean process that's very linear. But master planning is not. I can tell you today that master plans, as we said, are a framework for making decisions. So we're starting here today. We understand where we want to be. Things are going to change along the way as you go through this. Like I said, you guys are making decisions every day. So the idea with master plan is you're going to pick off and start to implement projects after the master plan is decided. But along the way, we're going to check in and see how things are going and what's changed. You know, has your enrollment changed? Has community growth changed? Have you started another housing development and you're going to see an influx in kids? Has the cost of construction changed? Has borrowing rates changed? All of those things will impact the master plan along the way. So plan, where are we headed? So we're going to start with the big vision, and then we're going to go through what the potential incremental steps to get there could be. So first, we looked at 3 options. I think we actually did about 5 or 6 different options, but these were kind of the 3 options that the task force felt like we should potentially consider. The first one is what we call right size. So this is kind of status quo. If you kept all of your buildings in the same configuration they are today and focused on right sizing and renovating Lincoln, what would your future look like? The next option was fresh start. What if we said we need a new Lincoln? While looking at a new Lincoln, what if you took the chance to reconfigure? So this option looks at, we'll talk about it in more detail, what if we moved 2nd grade to be a true 2-6, more of a true elementary school, saw some of those efficiencies in staff sharing that are people traveling between Grant and Lincoln right now. That would free up space in Grant to move pre-K over. And then what if we move the district office to be in the Mix Center? And that would allow us to offload Kendall, to sell that property and have one less property we're trying to manage, also put some dollars kind of back into the community tax base. And then the last option is replace in place. This really says, what if B is the vision, and we understand that the funds here are potentially too much and we're going to have to take an incremental step to get there. So right size, as I said, really the focus here is on providing a renovation and addition at Lincoln. Within this plan, you can kind of see by each building kind of what the goals over 10 years would be. So generally at Kendall, Grant, Mick, Bus Barn, and Mac, generally continuing with general maintenance and improvements at those buildings. At Lincoln, we'd be doing a complete renovation and addition. The 712 building, I'll show you plans in just a second, would be about a secure entry vestibule, widening your existing field by moving the bleachers, and doing any ADA required changes in order to move competition soccer there, which would allow you to not have to use some other facilities for practice. And then lastly, the sports complex, acquiring that property and making only kind of ADA needed required changes in order to get it compliant. So what that could potentially look like, you kind of have 2 separate buildings at Lincoln Center right now. So the idea is that we could do a major renovation in both pieces, put a new commons and classroom connector on that building. Over at the 712, really renovating within your existing to create a new secure entry sequence. And over at the field, moving visitor stands back, which will allow us to widen that existing surface, potentially doing a home restroom renovation. And long term, likely after kind of this phase of master plan, looking at potentially where, if we ever need to, would we add on to 712, where would we do a new restroom building if we needed to, but not kind of within the framework likely of the next 10 years. So generally, things would look very much like they do today in this plan, but with a renovated Lincoln. I think one of the biggest challenges with this plan is how do you get it done? You have kids in Lincoln, you don't have a lot of extra space, and so this is a messy project to move through to try to move a few kids out, renovate little chunks, and do summer work likely over a long period of time. So the next plan, as I talked about, is really about building a new 2nd through 6th grade facility at the Lincoln Center site. So you can kind of see the moving pieces here. The idea is to move 2nd grade to Lincoln. That gives you space to move pre-K to Grant, to move the district office to Mick. And the idea is hopefully in the next few years as you graduate those large class sizes, that you can contract and really hopefully fit into the 712 building and not rely on the Mick Center for classroom space. This allows us to use that for district office and also get to our kind of secure perimeter of 712 over time. The components at the sports complex and at the field are the same in this project. So you can see here the idea is that we would build on the part of the site that you're not using so that we can keep kids in class but build on the back side of the site. But because of that in this option, you'd likely have to kind of do it as a denser plan and maybe even likely a 2-story because you just don't have a lot of space on that site to fit another building while you keep it occupied. And then lastly, replace in place. Really the same vision, but working on Lincoln Center in pieces. We'll talk about kind of the cost in just a second, but generally this plan is the same, but says that we would build the phase 1 of Lincoln and then come back down the road and do a phase 2. So what could that look like? I think the biggest priority word is classroom spaces. You know, you have small classrooms and that side of the building is the most challenging right now. And so potentially what that would look like is building a new one-story classroom addition on the north side of that site, allows you to keep things functioning here and tie in and connect to your existing kitchen, gym, and music wing. That allows this to really function. Likely, the time between those phases is likely 15 to 20 years that you could go between those phases, because it really has to do with when you could afford to bond again or do the second phase of that project. That doesn't mean for sure it would be that. You could start to bite it off in phases. We're now projecting a long ways out to try to figure out, but that's kind of the constraints that we understand. So then at phase 2, come back, you would have demoed the classroom wing in phase 1, but phase 2, come back and add a gym, commons, and kitchen addition, and really then have a complete new 2-6 facility on the Lincoln Center site. All of the other pieces, relocated district office, widening this field, secure entry, are all the same kind of throughout those components. So really why, everyone would love to build a new, well, not necessarily everyone, but the goal would always be to build as much as you can right away. And so I think that what we're really looking at is a balancing act. We're trying to look years out, 5, 10 years out, to understand how much will you be able to afford as a district. There's a lot of things that impact that. How many students you will have, how much space we need. What does community growth look like? What are property valuations? What is your tax base, and what is the levy rate you would need to do that project? Governance changes. I like to say that our state is changing the game every day on public education and also how we fund it. So there's lots of things that could change with how we fund school construction projects between now and then. Interest rates, we know they're high right now. Everyone's hoping they're going down. That directly impacts how much space you can buy. And then unknowns. No one predicted COVID, and it impacted all of our industries. And so there's lots of unknowns as we look out. But generally what we know is that district valuation, we're anticipating, will grow at about 3.5% annually. And likely construction, what we have seen is we're predicting about a 4 to 6% a year change in the cost of construction. So what this says is right now, we understand how much you can afford as a district because we know what your financials are, and we also know how much construction costs. But as we look out, and the farther we look out, it becomes harder to understand. And just in perspective, as you look back, construction costs over the last 10 years, like I said, have increased 42%. Over that same time, your district valuation growth has only gone up 23%, and that's what your funding streams are tied to. So generally, as we look at a brand new Lincoln, that kind of middle option, likely that falls above your ability to fund as a district or right at the top. And I can tell you that the levy rate associated with that would be a very, very, very hard sell in any community to pass kind of a brand new Lincoln Center. And so really, as we looked at a task force then, I think very clearly the task force felt like right-sizing Lincoln, likely putting a new coat of paint, new systems in it, felt like a fairly short-term solution and a Band-Aid fix for Lincoln. Like I said, fresh start. The discussion there is likely it exceeds the amount that the community is willing to support, or even potentially kind of what our parameters are. So the task force has been kind of looking and thinking recently about moving forward with a phased approach to Lincoln. But this is what tonight we want to get feedback on, are kind of these options as we move forward. I'm going long, so I'll try to pick this up.
You're okay.
So we'll come back then. We focused a lot just right now on where we want to be, what's the plan, but we're going to talk about what the incremental steps could be like between. So the first bucket is maintain. What if we did not change anything about our funding that we have as a district? Right now you have access, as I said, to Save Dollars and Board PEPAL. These are existing buckets. So this step of the plan would say that we're not going to add any additional funds. How do we budget over the next 10 years? So generally what that would be is out of kind of about 13 million that you would have between those two pots over 10 years, about 8.2 of that would go for bond payments for past projects. We talked about that borrowing for the work that you've already done. And then that leaves kind of these buckets. So about 180,000 for general maintenance across the district, things like some general field maintenance, gym floor projects, a little bit, I think just a few grand for kind of doing mowing and things like that at sports complex, and doing a few parking lot repairs. And then buckets for about 100,000 for technology replacement. We know now that we have one-to-one devices, we have to keep up on one-to-one devices for students. and then about $400,000 for kind of bus lease and replacement cycles. So you can see generally not a lot of kind of big significant projects, kind of small scale repairs that we'd be doing as a part of this. You can also start to see how does it start to check the boxes on the things that the task force has prioritized from kind of conversations with the community. So generally over 10 years, we talked about what the work would look like. I think that we really talked about there are 2 projects that don't fit in the current bucket, the Lincoln Center roof repairs and high school secure entry, but are still major priorities that the district has to do something about. And so likely if we moved forward without adding any additional funds, the district would have to borrow further against future SAVE to complete those projects sometime over the next few years. So what if we did have a voter PEPAL? How would the next 10 years potentially look different? So this adds that 1 bucket of funding. In that case, the district would have about $17.5 million kind of over the next 10 years. So you can see generally all of the same projects down here, but then kind of Lincoln Center roof repairs fit in without borrowing against any future revenues, the secure entry vestibule. Then also adds about $370,000 a year that the district would spend on going through and replacing classroom furniture, additional general maintenance, new finishes, kind of in a cycle, slowly moving through the district, and also on getting to a self-sufficient and compliant field facilities. So over the next 10 years, like I said, looks very similar, kind of pretty much small-scale projects, small-scale repairs, adding that kind of finish replacement cycle, furniture replacement cycle, moving those bleachers and widening the existing playing surface, and making the ADA required changes needed at those complexes. And then lastly, kind of going through and likely doing some playground surfacing and drainage at the elementary schools. And then those Lincoln roof repairs and high school secure entry kind of fit in this pot of money without any additional borrowing from the district. So lastly, kind of what if we had all of these buckets at some point over the next 10 years, what would that same plan look like? That would give the district the ability to really check most of these boxes off. We would go through and be able to do that phase 1 or major project at Lincoln, and all of that then really fits kind of in this bucket. Now you're probably asking like, well, exactly how many classrooms are we going to get in phase 1 and exactly how many square feet? And what I can tell you is we're trying to predict too far out to be able to tell you exactly that. Because like we talked about, the cost of construction and the valuation of your district are the main 2 factors as we look at it. So another big factor is time. How long do we want to wait, or how long do we need to wait before we would go out to the community with a question like this? And so what we know is that you can afford more construction today than you can tomorrow, than you can in 5 years or 10 years. But you have to be at a point that you could get 60% voter approval to go through it. So what we've talked about is likely that project is 4, 5, or up to 10 years out before we would go out to the community and ask for a project like that. So the timeline then over 10 years looks very much the same. We're focusing first on annual projects, annual maintenance, replacement cycles, getting Lincoln roof repairs done, but doing that in a way that where we understand that likely we're going to replace major sections of Lincoln. So making decisions to make shorter term repairs to the roof at Lincoln with the idea that we're going to do major work there, going through and doing the high school secure entry, and then after some time, like I said, kind of undecided amount of time, going to the community for potentially a general obligation bond and focusing that work on the repairs, the replacement in phases of Lincoln. That was
Did
a lot
good.
to say.
Did good.
So what are the next steps? Tonight, like I said, we're going to turn this over for people to be able to ask questions. We're going to have people up here that you can ask questions about design and construction to, district questions over there. So if you have questions about anything in the district, priorities, needs, funding, if you want to go talk about how you're not happy about the X, Y, or Z, they'll be more than willing to answer any questions, but specifically design and construction over here. Stick around for Lincoln Center tour. How soon do you want to leave for that, Joel?
We'll kind of see how everybody's doing, but 10 minutes or so maybe, you know, we can see. Yeah.
Generally tonight, we're looking to gather questions and input, so while you're at the tables, we'll be taking notes about what questions are being asked. If you want to give your input more anonymously, there's slips of paper, you can leave those with questions. All of that information will be compiled into an FAQ that goes out as this kind of gets posted out on the district website so people can see the responses. Then we're going to really spend the summer kind of refining from feedback we hear. This will come back out again in the fall in a more kind of formal approach to gain input. Also, I think the biggest thing is we want you to go out and talk about this. We want you to engage with friends, family, neighbors, coworkers. Make sure people understand the district is talking about this. Make sure they understand the options and that they're getting educated and giving feedback. I think the hardest thing is to get people to pay attention at this point in time, not on a day when it comes to a vote, but start to pay attention now when you can really impact the path forward. So like I said, additional meeting in the fall, and then eventually this master plan will get finalized in fall of 2024. So that was a lot. Thank you. As you ask questions. So like I said again, thank you for coming tonight. Questions up here for design and construction. Questions will be over here for more kind of
Yeah, no, thank you, Laura. And we do want you to stay and ask questions or give input. And like Laura said, we'll pull all of this together into something that can be shared, will be shared with this recording, with the presentation, because we want, this is a great group, but we want even more ears and more ideas. So we do ask that you stay and hit us with questions here, or join Joel for the Lincoln tour here a little bit.
We have some of the slides up there, and then also some of the other kind of drawings if you want to come take a look in any more detail, or the roadmap slides are up here too that you can take a look. So thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you guys.